comes from Sarah, who was 12 years old when she attended what she thought would be a typical birthday sleepover at her best friend Emma's house. Sarah had been to Emma's house dozens of times before, so she felt completely comfortable spending the night there. Emma lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood with her parents and older brother, in one of those picture-perfect houses with a white picket fence and a well-manicured lawn. The sleepover started normally enough. Sarah arrived around 6 in the evening with her sleeping bag and overnight bag, ready for a night of movies, junk food, and typical 12-year-old girl activities. Emma's mom greeted her at the door with a warm smile and told the girls they could order pizza for dinner. Emma's dad was working late at the office, which wasn't unusual according to Emma, and her older brother Jake was supposedly out with friends for the evening. The two girls spent the first few hours of the night doing exactly what you'd expect. They painted their nails, talked about boys at school, and watched a romantic comedy that Emma had borrowed from her mom's collection. Everything felt perfectly normal and safe. Emma's mom checked on them around 9 o'clock, bringing them popcorn and reminding them not to stay up too late, even though she knew they probably would anyway. It wasn't until around 11:30 that night when things started to feel wrong. The girls were lying in Emma's bedroom with the lights off and supposedly trying to fall asleep, but still whispering and giggling about various topics. Emma's room was on the second floor of the house, with 2 windows that faced the backyard. One window was positioned directly above Emma's bed, while the other looked out toward the neighbor's house next door. Sarah was lying on an air mattress on the floor next to Emma's bed when she heard a sound that made her blood run cold. It was a soft tapping noise, rhythmic and deliberate, like someone gently knocking on glass. At first, she thought she might be imagining it, but then Emma sat up in her bed and whispered that she heard it too. The tapping was coming from the window above Emma's bed. Both girls froze, listening intently as the tapping continued. It wasn't random or accidental, like a tree branch hitting the glass in the wind. This was clearly intentional, with a pattern that suggested someone was trying to get their attention. Emma whispered that maybe it was her brother Jake trying to scare them, but Sarah pointed out that Jake would have to climb up to the second floor somehow, and there wasn't a ladder or tree near that particular window. The tapping stopped for about 30 seconds, and both girls held their breath, hoping whoever was outside had given up and left. But then it started again, this time more insistent and louder. Emma crept toward the window, staying low so she wouldn't be seen from outside. She carefully lifted one corner of the curtain and peeked out, then immediately dropped the curtain and backed away from the window with a look of pure terror on her face. Sarah asked what she had seen, but Emma was shaking so badly she could barely speak. She managed to whisper that there was a man standing on some kind of ladder outside her window, wearing dark clothes and staring directly at the glass. He had seen her looking out and had waved at her in a way that made her skin crawl. This wasn't Jake playing a prank or a confused neighbor checking on something. This was a complete stranger who had deliberately positioned himself outside a 12-year-old girl's bedroom window in the middle of the night. The girls quickly decided they needed to get Emma's mom immediately. They crept out of Emma's room and down the hallway to her parents' bedroom, moving as quietly as possible because they were terrified the man outside might hear them and know they were getting help. Emma gently shook her mom awake and whispered that there was someone outside her bedroom window. Emma's mom initially thought the girls were just letting their imaginations run wild, but the genuine terror in their voices convinced her to take them seriously. She told the girls to stay in her bedroom while she went to investigate. Instead of going directly to Emma's room, she first went to the kitchen and grabbed a large knife from the knife block, then called the police from the landline phone in the kitchen. While they waited for the police to arrive, Emma's mom went to Emma's bedroom to look out the window herself. By this time, the man was gone, but she could see clear evidence that someone had been there. There were ladder marks in the soft dirt beneath the window, and the screen had been partially cut, as if someone had been trying to get inside the house. The police arrived about 15 minutes later and searched the entire property and surrounding area, but they didn't find anyone. They took photos of the ladder marks and the damaged screen, and they interviewed both girls about what they had seen and heard. The officer who spoke with them was very kind but also very serious about the situation. He explained that this type of incident was more common than people realized, and that the girls had done exactly the right thing by getting an adult immediately. What made this situation even more terrifying was what the police discovered when they expanded their investigation. After canvassing the neighborhood and speaking with other residents, they learned that this wasn't an isolated incident. 3 other families on the same street had reported similar experiences over the past 2 months. In each case, someone had been spotted outside bedroom windows of houses with teenage or preteen girls, always late at night and always using a ladder to reach second-floor windows. The police also found out that this individual had been methodically studying the houses in the neighborhood, learning the layouts, and figuring out which bedrooms belonged to young girls. Security cameras from a house 2 blocks away had captured footage of a man walking through the neighborhood during daylight hours, taking photos of houses with his phone and making notes in a small notebook. Sarah's parents came to pick her up immediately after the police finished their investigation, and she never had another sleepover at Emma's house. In fact, the entire experience left her so shaken that she stopped accepting sleepover invitations altogether for several years. The man was never caught, despite an intensive police investigation and increased patrol presence in the neighborhood. The most disturbing part of this story is that Sarah later learned from Emma that this wasn't even the first time something like this had happened at their house. Emma's mom eventually admitted that they had noticed signs of someone watching their house for weeks before the sleepover incident, but they had convinced themselves it was nothing serious. There had been small things like footprints in their garden, items moved around on their back porch, and the feeling of being watched when they were in their backyard. Emma's family ended up moving to a different neighborhood 6 months later, partly because of this incident and partly because they never felt safe in that house again. Even with new locks, a security system, and regular police patrols, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were still being watched. The second story takes us to a different kind of nightmare entirely. This one comes from Marcus, who was 14 when he was invited to spend the night at his friend Derek's house for what was supposed to be an epic gaming marathon. Marcus had known Derek since elementary school, and they had been close friends for years. Derek lived with his grandmother in an older house on the outskirts of town, surrounded by thick woods and far from any other neighbors. Marcus arrived at Derek's house on a Friday evening, carrying his gaming controller and a bag full of snacks they had planned to consume during their all-night gaming session. Derek's grandmother greeted him warmly and showed him where he could put his things. She was a sweet, elderly woman who seemed genuinely happy to have Derek's friend over for the night. She explained that she would be going to bed early, but that the boys were welcome to stay up as late as they wanted playing their games. The first few hours of the sleepover went exactly as planned. The boys set up in Derek's bedroom, which was in the basement of the house, and started playing their favorite multiplayer games. The basement was the perfect setup for a gaming sleepover, with a large television, comfortable couches, and enough space for both boys to spread out with their controllers and snacks. Derek's grandmother had even brought them homemade cookies and sodas before she went to bed around 9 o'clock. Everything was going perfectly until around midnight, when they heard the most horrifying sound either of them had ever experienced. It started as a low moaning that seemed to be coming from somewhere else in the house, maybe the first floor or even the attic. At first, both boys thought it might be Derek's grandmother having a bad dream, or maybe the old house just making weird noises as it settled for the night. But the moaning continued and gradually became louder and more disturbing. It wasn't the kind of sound a person would make during a nightmare. This was something else entirely, something that made both boys feel sick to their stomachs just listening to it. The sound had an otherworldly quality that seemed to penetrate right through the walls and into their bones. Derek paused their game and listened carefully, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from and what might be causing it. Marcus suggested they go upstairs to check on Derek's grandmother, thinking she might be having some kind of medical emergency. But Derek shook his head and explained that this wasn't the first time he had heard sounds like this in the house late at night. What Derek told Marcus next made the situation infinitely more terrifying than either boy could have imagined. Derek had been living with his grandmother for 3 years, ever since his parents died in a car accident, and during that time, he had learned to accept certain disturbing realities about the house. His grandmother suffered from severe dementia, but what made her condition particularly horrifying was how it manifested during the nighttime hours. During the day, she was the sweet, caring woman who had greeted Marcus at the door. But when the sun went down, something in her mind seemed to break completely. Derek explained in hushed tones that his grandmother would often wander around the house at night, making those terrible sounds Marcus was hearing. Sometimes she would forget who she was, where she was, or even what year it was. She would call out for people who had been dead for decades, have conversations with invisible relatives, and sometimes become convinced that strangers were living in her house, trying to hurt her. The moaning grew louder and was now accompanied by the sound of shuffling footsteps moving back and forth across the floor above them. Marcus wanted to leave immediately, but Derek begged him to stay, explaining that his grandmother's episodes usually only lasted an hour or two before she would tire herself out and go back to sleep. Derek had dealt with this alone for years and was desperate for the company and normalcy that having a friend over provided. Against his better judgment, Marcus agreed to stay, but he insisted they go upstairs to make sure Derek's grandmother was safe and wasn't going to hurt herself during one of these episodes. Derek reluctantly agreed, and the two boys crept up the basement stairs toward the main floor of the house. What they discovered when they reached the top of the stairs was far worse than either of them had prepared for. Derek's grandmother was standing in the middle of the living room, still wearing her nightgown, but she was covered in what looked like blood. Her hands, arms, and the front of her nightgown were stained dark red, and she was holding a large kitchen knife that was also covered in blood. She was swaying back and forth and making those horrible moaning sounds while staring at something only she could see. Both boys froze at the top of the stairs, not knowing whether to run, call for help, or try to approach her. Derek whispered that he had never seen her like this before, that the episodes had never involved weapons or blood. Marcus was already reaching for his phone to call 911 when Derek's grandmother suddenly stopped moving and turned to look directly at them. What happened next will be burned into Marcus's memory for the rest of his life. Derek's grandmother smiled at them, but it wasn't the warm, loving smile she had given them earlier that evening. This smile was cold and predatory, and when she spoke, her voice was completely different from the gentle tone they had heard before. She asked them why they were awake so late and whether they wanted to join her in the kitchen for a midnight snack. Derek tried to approach his grandmother slowly, speaking to her in the calm, soothing voice he had learned to use during her episodes. He asked her to put down the knife and explained that she was scaring his friend. But instead of responding to Derek's voice, she laughed in a way that made both boys' skin crawl and started walking toward them with the knife still in her hand. Marcus grabbed Derek's arm and pulled him back toward the basement stairs, but Derek was torn between protecting his friend and protecting his grandmother. He couldn't abandon the only family he had left, even if she was currently terrifying both of them. The boys backed down a few steps, while Derek continued trying to talk to his grandmother, but she kept advancing toward them with that horrible smile and the bloody knife. It was only when Derek's grandmother reached the top of the basement stairs that Marcus realized the blood on her hands and nightgown wasn't human blood. In the better lighting near the stairs, he could see small feathers stuck to her fingers and what looked like pieces of raw chicken skin under her fingernails. Derek's grandmother had apparently gotten up in the middle of the night, gone to the kitchen, and begun preparing some kind of meal using raw chicken, but in her confused state, she had made an incredible mess. This realization made the situation slightly less terrifying, but Derek's grandmother was still holding a sharp knife and was clearly not in her right mind. Derek managed to convince her to go back to the kitchen by telling her he was hungry and would love to have whatever she was preparing. Marcus followed reluctantly, staying close to the back door in case they needed to escape quickly. In the kitchen, they discovered that Derek's grandmother had taken an entire raw chicken out of the refrigerator and had been attempting to cut it up, but her confused state had led to her making a chaotic mess instead of preparing an actual meal. There were pieces of raw chicken scattered across the counters, blood and chicken juices pooled on the floor, and several other kitchen knives laid out on the counter as if she had been trying to decide which one to use. Derek gently took the knife from his grandmother's hands and guided her to a chair at the kitchen table. He cleaned the blood and chicken residue from her hands with paper towels while speaking to her in soothing tones, and gradually her demeanor began to return to something closer to normal. The predatory smile faded, and she began to seem confused about why she was in the kitchen and why everything was so messy. Marcus spent the rest of the night helping Derek clean up the kitchen and make sure his grandmother was safely back in her bedroom. They didn't get any sleep, and Marcus never felt comfortable enough to relax, even after Derek's grandmother seemed to return to her normal, gentle personality. Every sound in the house made him jump, and he couldn't stop thinking about that cold, predatory smile and the way she had advanced toward them with the knife. When Derek's grandmother woke up the next morning, she had no memory of the previous night's events. She cheerfully made the boys breakfast and asked how they had enjoyed their sleepover, seemingly completely unaware of the terror she had put them through. Derek explained to Marcus that this was normal, that she never remembered her nighttime episodes, and that he had learned not to bring them up because it only upset and confused her. Marcus left Derek's house that morning with a heavy heart, realizing that his friend had been dealing with this situation alone for years. He wanted to help, but he also knew he couldn't handle another night like that. Derek never invited anyone else over for sleepovers after that night, and Marcus never told anyone else about what he had experienced, partly out of loyalty to Derek, and partly because he knew no one would believe him. The situation at Derek's house continued to deteriorate over the following months. Derek's grandmother's episodes became more frequent and more severe, and Derek was eventually forced to move in with other relatives when it became clear that the living situation was no longer safe for either of them. Derek's grandmother was placed in a memory care facility where she could receive proper supervision and medical attention. Years later, Marcus learned that Derek's grandmother had been suffering from a particularly aggressive form of dementia that often caused severe behavioral changes and episodes of confusion and aggression. The condition had been progressing for years, but Derek had been too young and too isolated to understand what was happening or to seek appropriate help. The night Marcus spent at Derek's house was one of the worst episodes Derek's grandmother had experienced, but it was far from the only one. Our third story comes from Jessica, who was 15 when she experienced what she still describes as the most terrifying night of her life. Jessica had been invited to spend the night at her friend Chloe's house, along with 2 other girls from their high school class. Chloe lived in a large, expensive house in one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in town, and her parents were known for being very permissive about what their daughter did, as long as she didn't get into any serious trouble. The sleepover was supposed to be a celebration because all 4 girls had made it onto the varsity cheerleading squad together. Chloe's parents had gone out of town for the weekend, leaving Chloe alone in the house with instructions to be responsible and not to have any boys over. The girls were thrilled to have the entire house to themselves for the night, and they had planned an evening of movies, makeovers, and the kind of deep conversations that teenage girls love to have during sleepovers. Jessica arrived at Chloe's house around 7 in the evening, and she was immediately struck by how large and luxurious everything was. The house had multiple floors, numerous bedrooms, a home theater, and even an indoor swimming pool. Chloe's parents were both successful doctors, and they had spared no expense in creating what seemed like the perfect family home. The other two girls, Amanda and Brianna, arrived shortly after Jessica, and the four friends spent the first part of the evening exploring the house and marveling at all the expensive furnishings and high-tech gadgets. Chloe gave them a full tour, showing off her parents' master suite, her dad's home office, and the basement recreation room where they planned to spend most of the night. Everything was going perfectly until around 10 o'clock, when Chloe suggested they explore a part of the house she had never shown them before. She led them to a door at the end of a hallway on the second floor that she explained led to what used to be her older brother's bedroom. Her brother had moved out for college 2 years earlier, and her parents had converted his room into a storage space for things they didn't know what else to do with. Chloe opened the door to reveal a room that was completely different from the rest of the perfectly decorated house. This room was cluttered with boxes, old furniture, and random items that looked like they had been hastily shoved in there to get them out of the way. But what caught Jessica's attention immediately wasn't the clutter, it was the smell. The room had a strange, unpleasant odor that reminded her of something rotting or decaying. The four girls entered the room cautiously, covering their noses and trying to figure out what was causing the terrible smell. Chloe seemed as surprised by the odor as the other girls were, explaining that she rarely came into this room and had never noticed such a strong smell before. They began looking around the room, trying to locate the source of the stench. It was Amanda who made the discovery that changed everything. While moving some boxes to get to a window she wanted to open for fresh air, she uncovered something that made her scream and immediately back away from that corner of the room. Hidden behind several large boxes was what appeared to be a large, dark stain on the carpet, surrounded by more of those terrible smells. All four girls gathered around the stain, trying to figure out what it was and why it was there. The stain was roughly circular and about 3 feet in diameter, and it had clearly been there for a long time. The carpet around the stain was discolored and appeared to have been scrubbed repeatedly, but whatever had caused the stain had penetrated too deeply to be completely removed. Chloe was as confused as the other girls about what the stain might be. She insisted that she had never seen it before and that her brother had never mentioned anything about spilling something that would leave such a large, permanent mark on the carpet. The girls speculated about various possibilities, from spilled paint to a large potted plant that had leaked, but none of their theories explained the horrible smell that seemed to be emanating from that area of the room. Jessica suggested they ask Chloe's parents about the stain when they returned from their trip, but Chloe seemed reluctant to bring it up with them. She explained that her parents had been acting strangely about her brother's room ever since he moved out, and that they got upset whenever she asked questions about why they had converted it to storage so quickly after he left for college. The girls decided to leave the room and return to their sleepover activities, but none of them could stop thinking about what they had discovered. The smell from the room seemed to follow them down the hallway, and Jessica found herself feeling increasingly uneasy about the entire situation. Something about Chloe's reaction to finding the stain had seemed off, as if she knew more than she was letting on. Around midnight, when the other girls had fallen asleep in the basement recreation room, Jessica found herself unable to sleep. She kept thinking about the stain in the storage room and the way Chloe had acted when they found it. Unable to shake her curiosity and growing sense of unease, Jessica decided to go back upstairs to the storage room and investigate further. Using her phone's flashlight to navigate through the dark house, Jessica made her way back to the second floor and the storage room. The smell hit her as soon as she opened the door, even stronger than it had been earlier in the evening. She covered her nose with her shirt and made her way to the corner where they had found the stain. In the light from her phone, the stain looked even more ominous than it had before. Jessica noticed details they had missed earlier, including what looked like scratch marks in the wall near the stain and several small holes in the drywall that appeared to have been hastily filled with spackling compound. The more she examined the area, the more convinced she became that something terrible had happened in this room. Jessica decided she needed to investigate more thoroughly, even though every instinct was telling her to leave the room immediately. She began moving more boxes away from the stained area, and what she discovered made her stomach turn. Beneath one particularly heavy box, she found several pieces of torn fabric that looked like they might have once been part of clothing. The fabric was stained with the same dark substance that had created the large stain on the carpet. As she examined the fabric pieces more closely, Jessica realized they weren't just random scraps. They appeared to be deliberately cut, as if someone had been trying to destroy evidence of something. One piece looked like it might have come from a shirt, while another appeared to be part of what was once a pair of jeans. All of the fabric pieces had that same terrible smell that permeated the entire room. Jessica's hands were shaking as she used her phone to take pictures of everything she was finding. She knew she needed evidence of what was in this room, but she also knew she needed to be careful not to disturb anything too much. The more she uncovered, the more convinced she became that something horrible had happened in this room, and that Chloe's family knew about it. Hidden beneath more boxes, Jessica found something that made her blood run cold. It was a driver's license, partially damaged and stained, but still readable enough to make out a name and photo. The name on the license was Michael Chen, and the photo showed a young man who looked like he was probably in his early 20s. Jessica had never heard Chloe mention anyone named Michael, and the license had expired 3 years earlier. The discovery of the driver's license changed everything for Jessica. This wasn't just some mysterious stain from a household accident. This was evidence that someone named Michael Chen had been in this room, and based on the condition of his identification and the other evidence scattered around the area, something terrible had happened to him. Jessica quickly took photos of the driver's license and all the other evidence she had uncovered, then carefully placed everything back where she had found it. She knew she needed to get out of the room immediately and figure out what to do with this information. Her mind was racing with possibilities, none of them good. As she was preparing to leave the room, Jessica heard footsteps in the hallway outside. Someone else was awake and moving around the house. She quickly turned off her phone's flashlight and crouched behind some boxes, hoping whoever was in the hallway wouldn't come into the storage room. The footsteps stopped directly outside the door, and Jessica held her breath, terrified of being discovered. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps continued down the hallway, and Jessica heard a door close somewhere else in the house. She waited several more minutes before carefully making her way out of the storage room and back downstairs to where the other girls were sleeping. Her heart was pounding so hard she was sure it would wake everyone up, but somehow she managed to slip back into her sleeping bag without disturbing anyone. Jessica spent the rest of the night lying awake, staring at the ceiling and trying to process what she had discovered. She kept looking at the photos on her phone, hoping she had somehow misunderstood what she was seeing, but the evidence was undeniable. Someone named Michael Chen had been in that room, and something violent had happened to him. When morning came, Jessica was exhausted, but determined to get out of Chloe's house as soon as possible. She made up an excuse about her parents needing her home early and called for a ride before any of the other girls were fully awake. Chloe seemed disappointed that Jessica was leaving so early, but she didn't question the excuse. As Jessica was waiting for her ride, she couldn't help but study Chloe's face, looking for any sign that she knew what was hidden in that storage room. Chloe seemed completely normal, chatting about their plans for the upcoming school week and laughing about something funny that had happened during the night. Either she was an incredible actress, or she genuinely had no idea what Jessica had discovered upstairs. Jessica left Chloe's house that morning with a terrible secret weighing on her conscience. She knew she had evidence of what appeared to be a serious crime, but she also knew that coming forward with that evidence would destroy her friendship with Chloe and potentially put her own safety at risk. She spent the entire ride home trying to decide what to do. Over the following weeks, Jessica became obsessed with researching Michael Chen and trying to figure out what had happened to him. She spent hours online searching for missing person reports, news articles, and any other information she could find about someone with that name. What she discovered made the situation even more terrifying. Michael Chen had been reported missing by his family 18 months earlier. According to the missing person report Jessica found online, Michael had been a college student who worked part-time at a local restaurant. He had disappeared after leaving work one evening, and despite an extensive police investigation, no trace of him had ever been found. The case had gone cold after several months, with no new leads. The missing person report included a photo of Michael that matched the picture on the driver's license Jessica had found in Chloe's house. There was no doubt that the evidence in that storage room was connected to Michael Chen's disappearance. Jessica realized she was potentially sitting on information that could solve a missing person case and bring closure to Michael's family. But Jessica also realized that coming forward with this information would implicate Chloe's family in Michael's disappearance, and she had no idea how they might react if they discovered she had been snooping around in their house. She began to worry about her own safety, especially when she remembered the footsteps she had heard in the hallway that night. What if someone in Chloe's family had seen her in the storage room? Jessica's paranoia grew over the following days when she noticed that Chloe seemed to be acting differently toward her at school. Chloe was still friendly, but there was something in her eyes that made Jessica uncomfortable, as if Chloe was studying her and trying to figure out if she knew something. Jessica began to wonder if Chloe had discovered that someone had been in the storage room that night. The situation came to a head about 2 weeks after the sleepover, when Jessica was walking home from school alone. A car began following her, staying about a block behind, but clearly matching her pace and turning whenever she turned. Jessica recognized the car as belonging to Chloe's father, and she began to panic, convinced that Chloe's family had figured out what she knew and were planning to silence her. Jessica managed to lose the car by cutting through a park and taking a route home that would be impossible to follow in a vehicle, but the experience left her terrified and convinced that she was in real danger. She realized she couldn't keep this secret any longer, both for her own safety and because Michael Chen's family deserved to know what had happened to him. That evening, Jessica made one of the most difficult decisions of her life. She called the police tip line and reported what she had found in Chloe's house. She provided them with the photos she had taken and gave them all the details about the storage room and the evidence she had discovered there. The police took her report seriously and told her they would investigate immediately. The investigation that followed was swift and thorough. Police obtained a search warrant for Chloe's house and discovered not only the evidence Jessica had reported, but additional evidence that had been hidden in other parts of the house. The investigation revealed that Michael Chen had been killed in that storage room during what appeared to be a robbery gone wrong, and that Chloe's parents had covered up the crime to protect their reputation and careers. Chloe's parents were arrested and eventually convicted of manslaughter and obstruction of justice. The investigation revealed that Michael had been doing landscaping work at their house when he accidentally witnessed Chloe's father engaged in illegal drug dealing. Michael had been killed to prevent him from reporting what he had seen, and the family had spent months covering up the evidence. Chloe herself was cleared of any wrongdoing, as the investigation determined that she had genuinely been unaware of what her parents had done. However, the revelation destroyed her family and her life as she knew it. She was placed in foster care after her parents' arrest, and she never spoke to Jessica again. Jessica's decision to come forward ultimately brought justice for Michael Chen and closure for his family, but it also changed her life forever. She testified at the trial and had to live with the knowledge that her actions, while morally correct, had destroyed the life of someone she had considered a friend. The experience taught her that sometimes doing the right thing comes with a terrible personal cost. Our fourth story takes us into the world of Marcus, who was 13 when he experienced a sleepover that revealed the darkest side of family dynamics he never knew existed. Marcus had been invited to spend the night at his friend Tyler's house, and he was particularly excited because Tyler's family seemed to have everything Marcus wished his own family had. Tyler's parents were wealthy, his house was huge, and they seemed to have a perfect family relationship that Marcus envied. Tyler lived in a mansion-style house with his parents and his younger sister Emma, who was 11 years old. Marcus had been to Tyler's house several times for birthday parties and other events, and he was always impressed by how polished and perfect everything seemed. Tyler's father was a successful businessman who owned several companies, and his mother was a former beauty queen who now spent her time involved in various charity organizations. Marcus arrived at Tyler's house on a Friday evening, carrying his overnight bag and looking forward to what he expected would be an amazing sleepover experience. Tyler's mother greeted him at the door with her usual perfect smile and welcoming attitude, and Tyler's father shook his hand and asked about his grades and his plans for high school. Everything seemed exactly as Marcus expected it would be. The evening started normally, with the boys playing video games in Tyler's enormous bedroom and eating pizza that had been ordered from an expensive restaurant rather than a typical pizza chain. Tyler's parents checked on them periodically throughout the evening, always appearing cheerful and interested in what the boys were doing. Tyler's little sister, Emma, even joined them for a while, playing some of their games and laughing along with their jokes. It wasn't until around 11 o'clock that night that Marcus began to notice something was wrong with the family dynamics in Tyler's house. The first sign was when Tyler's father called Tyler downstairs for what he said was an important conversation. Tyler seemed nervous about this summons, and he asked Marcus to wait in his room while he went to talk to his father privately. Marcus could hear voices coming from downstairs, but he couldn't make out the words of the conversation. What he could hear was the tone, and it was clear that Tyler's father was angry about something. The conversation lasted for about 20 minutes, and when Tyler returned to his room, he seemed shaken and upset, though he tried to hide it from Marcus. Marcus asked what the conversation had been about, but Tyler brushed off the question and said it was just his father checking on his grades and reminding him about some responsibilities he had around the house. Tyler's explanation didn't match the tone of the conversation Marcus had overheard, but he decided not to push the issue since Tyler clearly didn't want to talk about it. Around midnight, both boys were startled by the sound of shouting coming from somewhere else in the house. The voices were clearly Tyler's parents, and they were having what sounded like a serious argument about something. Tyler immediately became tense and told Marcus they should put on headphones and turn up their music so they wouldn't have to listen to the fighting. But Marcus was curious and concerned about what was happening in the house, especially when he heard what sounded like Tyler's little sister crying somewhere in the midst of the argument. He asked Tyler if they should check on Emma, but Tyler quickly told him that interfering in his parents' arguments was strictly forbidden and would only make things worse for everyone. The argument continued for over an hour, with voices rising and falling and occasional sounds that Marcus couldn't identify, but that made him increasingly uncomfortable. Tyler seemed to be trying to act like nothing unusual was happening, but Marcus could see that he was scared and upset by whatever was going on downstairs. Around 1:30 in the morning, the house finally became quiet, and both boys began to relax, thinking the argument was over and that Tyler's parents had resolved whatever they had been fighting about. Tyler suggested they try to get some sleep since they had planned to spend the next day at an amusement park with Tyler's family, but their relief was short-lived. About 30 minutes after the house had become quiet, Marcus was awakened by the sound of Tyler's bedroom door opening very slowly and quietly. In the dim light coming through Tyler's window, Marcus could see a figure standing in the doorway, but he couldn't immediately tell who it was. The figure stood in the doorway for several long seconds, not moving or speaking, just watching the boys sleep. Marcus pretended to be asleep while trying to figure out who was standing there and what they wanted. Eventually, the figure stepped into the room, and Marcus could see that it was Tyler's father. But something about his posture and behavior was completely different from the cheerful, welcoming man who had greeted Marcus earlier that evening. Tyler's father approached Tyler's bed and gently shook Tyler awake, then whispered something in his ear that Marcus couldn't hear. Tyler immediately got up and followed his father out of the room, leaving Marcus alone and wondering what was happening. The way Tyler had responded to his father's summons suggested this was not an unusual occurrence, but something about the secrecy and the late hour made Marcus feel deeply uncomfortable. Marcus lay in Tyler's bed for what felt like hours, waiting for Tyler to return and wondering what kind of conversation required such secrecy and occurred in the middle of the night. He could occasionally hear muffled voices coming from somewhere in the house, but he couldn't determine where Tyler and his father had gone or what they were discussing. When Tyler finally returned to his room, it was nearly 3 in the morning, and he looked exhausted and upset. Marcus pretended to be asleep, but he watched through barely opened eyes as Tyler sat on the edge of his bed for several minutes with his head in his hands, clearly struggling with whatever had just transpired. The next morning, Marcus woke up to find Tyler already awake and staring at the ceiling with a blank expression. When Marcus asked how he had slept, Tyler gave a forced smile and said he had slept fine, but his eyes told a different story. Tyler seemed like a completely different person from the confident, happy friend Marcus thought he knew. During breakfast, Tyler's family appeared to be back to their perfect, polished facade. Tyler's parents were cheerful and welcoming, discussing their plans for the day and asking Marcus about his family and his interests. Tyler's little sister Emma was also present, but Marcus noticed she seemed subdued and kept glancing nervously at her father throughout the meal. The planned trip to the amusement park proceeded as scheduled, but Marcus found himself studying Tyler's family dynamics more carefully than he ever had before. He began to notice subtle signs of tension and fear that he had missed during his previous visits. Emma seemed to flinch whenever her father raised his voice, even when he was just calling to someone across a crowded area. Tyler appeared to be constantly monitoring his father's mood and adjusting his own behavior accordingly. Most disturbing to Marcus was a conversation he accidentally overheard between Tyler and Emma while they were waiting in line for a ride. Emma was asking Tyler about something that had happened the night before, and Tyler was telling her in hushed tones that she needed to forget about it and never mention it to anyone, especially not to any of their friends or teachers. Marcus began to piece together that Tyler's perfect family was hiding some very dark secrets, and that both Tyler and Emma were living in fear of their father's unpredictable behavior. The cheerful, successful businessman that Marcus had always admired was apparently capable of behavior that terrified his own children. The rest of the amusement park visit was uncomfortable for Marcus, as he struggled to maintain normal conversations and interactions while processing what he was beginning to understand about Tyler's home life. He found himself feeling guilty for envying Tyler's family situation, and he began to appreciate his own family's genuine warmth and stability in a way he never had before. When Marcus returned home the next day, he couldn't stop thinking about what he had witnessed at Tyler's house. He was torn between wanting to help his friend and not knowing how to approach such a sensitive situation. Marcus had no concrete evidence of abuse or wrongdoing, just a collection of observations and instincts that told him something was very wrong in Tyler's household. Over the following weeks at school, Marcus began paying closer attention to Tyler's behavior and demeanor. He noticed that Tyler often seemed tired and distracted, and that he frequently had minor injuries that he explained away as sports-related or accidental. Marcus also noticed that Tyler never wanted to talk about his family anymore, and that he seemed to prefer spending time at other people's houses rather than inviting friends to his own home. Marcus eventually decided to confide in his own parents about his concerns regarding Tyler's family situation. His parents took his observations seriously and helped him understand that there are resources available for children who might be experiencing abuse or neglect at home. They encouraged Marcus to be a supportive friend to Tyler, while also watching for opportunities to connect Tyler with adults who could help him if he needed assistance. The situation at Tyler's house remained a source of concern for Marcus throughout the rest of their friendship, but Tyler never opened up about what was really happening in his family. Years later, Marcus learned through mutual friends that Tyler's father had eventually been arrested for tax evasion and fraud related to his business dealings, and that the investigation had revealed evidence of domestic violence within the household. Tyler and Emma had been placed in protective custody during the investigation, and Tyler's mother had eventually divorced his father and moved the children to a different state to start over. Marcus never had the opportunity to reconnect with Tyler after his family's situation became public, but he often wondered whether his friend had finally found the safety and stability that had been missing from his childhood. Our fifth and final story comes from Ashley, who was 16 when she experienced a sleepover that taught her that sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones we trust the most. Ashley had been invited to spend the night at her friend Samantha's house, along with 2 other girls from their high school drama club. The sleepover was supposed to be a celebration of their successful performance in the school play, and all 4 girls were excited to spend the night together. Samantha lived with her single mother and her mother's boyfriend Rick in a modest house in a quiet neighborhood. Ashley had met Rick several times during previous visits to Samantha's house, and he had always seemed like a friendly, responsible adult who was good to Samantha and her mother. Rick worked as a mechanic and often helped Samantha with her car troubles, and he had even volunteered to help with set construction for the school play. Ashley arrived at Samantha's house around 7 in the evening, along with the other 2 girls, Megan and Brittany. Samantha's mother greeted them warmly and explained that she would be working a night shift at the hospital where she was employed as a nurse, but that Rick would be home to supervise and make sure the girls had everything they needed. Jessica soon discovered that Rick's helpful demeanor masked something far more sinister. Throughout the evening, his behavior became increasingly inappropriate as he found excuses to check on the girls, lingering in doorways and making comments that made all 4 teenagers uncomfortable. When Samantha's mother called to check in around midnight, Rick lied about the girls being asleep when they were clearly still awake, and increasingly frightened by his behavior. The situation escalated when Rick attempted to enter Samantha's bedroom around 2 in the morning, claiming he heard suspicious noises. The girls had barricaded the door and called 911, leading to Rick's arrest and the discovery that he had a history of similar incidents that Samantha's mother had been unaware of. Ashley's quick thinking to document Rick's inappropriate behavior with her phone provided crucial evidence that helped protect other potential victims. These 5 stories serve as chilling reminders that the sleepovers we remember from childhood weren't always the innocent fun we thought they were. From mysterious stalkers targeting young girls to families hiding dark secrets behind perfect facades, these experiences show us that danger can lurk in the most unexpected places. Each person who shared their story wanted others to understand that trusting your instincts and speaking up when something feels wrong can literally save lives. So the next time you're invited to spend the night somewhere new, remember these stories. Pay attention to red flags, trust your gut feelings, and never hesitate to call for help when something doesn't feel right. Sometimes, the most ordinary sleepover can become a nightmare, but being aware and prepared can make all the difference between becoming a victim and staying safe.